a heart the size of a peppercorn, a jaw that can't close, an empire ruled by bodies losing the genetic lottery, again and again. Why did Europe's mightiest crowns keep marrying closer, even as their children died younger? The answer is a secret ritual of power that turned palaces into labs and heirs into experiments. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What I'm about to reveal isn't just a story about royal marriages gone wrong. It's the systematic destruction of human genetics played out across Europe's most prestigious palaces, where the pursuit of pure blood created bloodlines so corrupted they could barely sustain life itself. By the end of this series, you'll understand how the very families who claimed divine right to rule became walking advertisements for why genetic diversity isn't just important, it's essential for human survival. The year was 1516, when a young man named Charles stepped onto Spanish soil to claim his inheritance as the new king. But Charles wasn't just any royal heir. He was the product of the most concentrated inbreeding experiment in human history, a living testament to what happens when royal families become so obsessed with keeping power within the family that they literally start marrying themselves. His great-great-great-grandmother was Joanna the Mad, whose own parents were second cousins. His grandfather was the son of siblings who shared the same four grandparents. His family tree didn't branch. It twisted back on itself like a serpent eating its own tail. Charles would become Charles X, Holy Roman Emperor, but his genetic legacy would haunt Europe for centuries. You see, when Charles married his first cousin Isabella of Portugal, he wasn't just continuing a romantic tradition. He was participating in the systematic genetic destruction of an entire continent's ruling class. Their children would carry the accumulated genetic damages children would carry even more of generations of inbreeding, and their children until the very act of royal birth became a gam story gets truly horrifying. These were with death itself. But here's where this isolated incidents or occasional lapses in judgment. European royalty had turned inbreeding into a science, a carefully calculated system designed to concentrate power, wealth, and bloodlines into an ever-tightening circle of genetic catastrophe. They mapped out marriages like military campaigns, treating human beings like chess pieces in a game where the ultimate prize was keeping the throne in the family, no matter the cost in human suffering. The mathematics of this destruction are staggering. By the time Charles II of Spain was born in 1661, his coefficient of inbreeding was higher than that of children born to full siblings. His family tree contained the same ancestors appearing dozens of times across multiple generations. He had 16 great-great-grandparents where he should have had 32. The genetic diversity that nature requires for healthy offspring had been systematically eliminated through centuries of deliberate inbreeding. Charles II's autopsy, performed by the royal physicians after his death in 1700, reads like a catalog of genetic horrors. His heart was the size of a peppercorn. His lungs were riddled with holes. His intestines were putrefied. His kidneys contained a single drop of blood. His head was full of water. The physicians concluded that it was a miracle he had lived at all, much less ruled an empire for 35 years, but Charles II was just the final, most visible victim of a system that had been destroying royal bloodlines across Europe for centuries. In France, the situation was equally catastrophic. The royal family had been intermarrying with such consistency that genetic defects appeared with predictable regularity. Hemophilia, the bleeding disease that would later devastate the Russian royal family, first appeared in European royalty through Queen Victoria, whose own family tree was a maze of cousin marriages and concentrated bloodlines. The French court at Versailles became a showcase for the results of systematic inbreeding. Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, suffered from numerous health problems that modern geneticists recognize as classic symptoms of inbreeding depression. His son, the Grand Dauphin, was intellectually limited and died young. His grandson became Louis XV, but produced a line so genetically damaged that the French Revolution would eventually sweep them all away, partly because the royal family had become so physically and mentally degraded that they could no longer effectively govern. In Austria, the Habsburg dynasty created their own unique brand of genetic nightmare. The famous Habsburg jaw, a protruding lower jaw that made eating and speaking difficult, became so pronounced in later generations that some family members couldn't close their mouths properly. This wasn't just a cosmetic problem. The deformity made it nearly impossible to chew food, leading to chronic malnutrition and digestive problems that weakened already compromised immune systems. The Habsburgs documented their own destruction with meticulous detail. Court artists were required to paint royal portraits, and these paintings provide a visual timeline of genetic degradation spanning centuries. Early Habsburg portraits show relatively normal-looking individuals, but as the generations progress and the inbreeding intensifies, the faces become increasingly distorted. Jaws protrude further, eyes grow more widely spaced, foreheads become more prominent, and expressions grow more vacant. Archduke Leopold Wilhelm of Austria, painted by David Teniers in 1651, displays the classic Habsburg features in their full horror. His lower jaw extends so far beyond his upper jaw that his mouth cannot close properly. His eyes are wide-set and vacant, suggesting the intellectual disabilities that accompanied the physical deformities. His entire face appears to have been stretched and distorted by the accumulated genetic damage of generations of inbreeding. The Portuguese royal family created their own version of genetic hell through systematic marriage with their Spanish cousins. King Sebastian III of Portugal, who ruled in the 16th century, was the product of multiple generations of cousin marriages. He never married or produced children, possibly due to genetic abnormalities that affected his reproductive capacity. His death in battle in 1578 ended the Portuguese royal line and led to the country's incorporation into the Spanish Empire under the genetically devastated Philip II. But perhaps nowhere was the destruction more visible than in the Holy Roman Empire, where the Habsburg family had created a genetic echo chamber that reverberated across Central Europe. Emperor Rudolf II, who ruled from 1576 to 1612, suffered from severe mental illness that modern psychiatrists recognize as likely caused by inbreeding depression. He became increasingly paranoid and reclusive, obsessed with alchemy and the occult, eventually becoming so dysfunctional that his own family had to remove him from power. Rudolf's brother Matthias, who succeeded him as emperor, was barely more functional. The Habsburg genetic legacy had created a ruling class that was literally incapable of ruling effectively. Court documents from this period describe emperors who couldn't make decisions, who flew into unpredictable rages, who suffered from mysterious illnesses that physicians couldn't diagnose or treat. The English royal family wasn't immune to these genetic disasters, though their version played out somewhat differently. The Tudor dynasty, which gave England some of its most famous monarchs, was riddled with reproductive failures and genetic abnormalities. Henry VIII's desperate search for a male heir wasn't just political ambition. It was the struggle of a genetically compromised bloodline to produce viable offspring. Henry's own health problems, including the leg ulcers that plagued his later years and the dramatic personality changes that transformed him from a Renaissance prince into a paranoid tyrant, show classic signs of genetic disorders. His daughter Mary suffered from phantom pregnancies and other reproductive abnormalities that prevented her from producing the Catholic heir she desperately wanted. Elizabeth I never married or had children, possibly due to genetic factors that made reproduction impossible or undesirable. The Stuart dynasty that followed the Tudors brought their own genetic baggage from Scotland. James I of England suffered from various health problems and produced children with mixed results. His son Charles I was physically weak and intellectually limited, contributing to the political disasters that led to the English Civil War and his eventual execution. But the most devastating example of royal inbreeding's consequences emerged in Russia with the Romanov dynasty. The introduction of hemophilia into the Russian royal family through marriage connections to Queen Victoria created a genetic time bomb that would eventually contribute to the fall of the entire Russian Empire. Tsarevich Alexei, the heir to the throne, inherited hemophilia through his mother Alexandra, who was Queen Victoria's granddaughter, and the product of multiple generations of cousin marriages among European royalty. Alexei's hemophilia wasn't just a personal tragedy, it became a political catastrophe. The desperate attempts to treat his condition led to the influence of Rasputin, the mystical healer whose presence at court scandalized Russian society and undermined confidence in the royal family. The genetic disease inherited through centuries of royal inbreeding literally helped trigger the Russian Revolution and the murder of the entire imperial family. The scientific evidence for the devastating effects of royal inbreeding is overwhelming. Modern genetic analysis of royal remains has confirmed what court physicians suspected for centuries, but dared not say openly. DNA studies of Habsburg remains show genetic diversity so limited that some individuals had inbreeding coefficients comparable to the offspring of parent-child matings. Studies of European royal genealogies reveal that by the 18th century, virtually every royal house on the continent was interconnected through multiple marriage relationships. The same genetic material was being recycled through generation after generation, concentrating harmful mutations while eliminating the genetic diversity necessary for healthy reproduction. The infant mortality rates among European royalty were catastrophically high, far exceeding those of the general population, despite access to the best medical care available. Royal children died in infancy at rates that would have been considered evidence of systematic poisoning if the genetic causes hadn't been so obvious to modern science. Mental illness plagued European royal families with such consistency that court physicians developed elaborate euphemisms to describe conditions that were clearly hereditary. Melancholy, nervous disorders, and religious mania appeared generation after generation in predictable patterns that followed the genetic inheritance of accumulated mutations. Physical deformities became so common in certain royal lines that they were accepted as normal family characteristics. The Habsburg jaw, the Bourbon nose, the Wettin weak chin, these weren't just family resemblances, they were genetic signatures of systematic inbreeding that had reached crisis levels. Yet, despite the obvious evidence of genetic catastrophe, European royal families continued their inbreeding practices right into the 20th century. The tradition was so deeply embedded in royal culture that even families that could observe the devastating results in their relatives continued to arrange cousin marriages for their own children. The persistence of these practices reveals something profound about power and human nature. European royalty became so obsessed with maintaining the purity of their bloodlines that they were willing to sacrifice the health, intelligence, and even lives of their descendants to preserve the fiction of divine right and genetic superiority. The irony is so thick you could cut it with a sword. These families who claimed God had chosen them to rule over common people had systematically destroyed the very genetic advantages that might have justified their authority. By the 19th century, European peasants were quite literally more genetically gifted than the monarchs who lorded over them. Consider the marriage of Napoleon III of France to Eugénie de Montijo in 1853. While Napoleon wasn't technically royal by birth, his marriage into European nobility brought him face to face with the genetic wasteland that centuries of inbreeding had created. Eugénie herself was connected to Spanish nobility through bloodlines so tangled that genealogists needed charts just to track the relationships. Their son, the Prince Imperial, inherited a collection of genetic problems that would plague him throughout his short life. But Napoleon III was actually fortunate compared to his contemporary, Franz Joseph the Sarnian of Austria-Hungary. Franz Joseph married his first cousin Elizabeth of Bavaria in 1854, continuing the Habsburg tradition of genetic self-destruction. With almost religious devotion, Elizabeth, known as Sisi, came from the Bavarian Wittelsbach line, a family so notorious for mental illness that they were called the Mad Wittelsbachs throughout Europe. The Wittelsbach madness wasn't just colorful court gossip. It was documented systematic mental illness that appeared in generation after generation with clockwork precision. King Ludwig II of Bavaria, Sisi's cousin, became so detached from reality that he spent the kingdom's entire treasury building fantasy castles while his people starved. His brother Otto was declared insane and locked away for the rest of his life. Their cousin Rudolf, son of Franz Joseph and Sisi, would eventually commit suicide in a scandal that rocked the entire continent. The marriage between Franz Joseph and Saze produced children who carried the accumulated genetic damage of both the Habsburg and Wittelsbach lines. Their daughter Gisela suffered from mysterious illnesses throughout her life. Their son Rudolf inherited the Wittelsbach mental instability and the Habsburg physical weakness, creating a combination so toxic that he couldn't bear to continue living with it. Rudolf's suicide at Meierling in 1889 wasn't just a personal tragedy or a romantic scandal. It was the logical endpoint of centuries of systematic genetic destruction. A prince who should have inherited the strength to rule an empire instead inherited a collection of mental and physical defects so severe that death seemed preferable to living with them. The scientific community of the 19th century began to understand what was happening, even if they couldn't explain it in modern genetic terms. Charles Darwin himself, writing in The Origin of Species, noted the connection between inbreeding and genetic weakness. He observed that organisms that mated with close relatives produced offspring with reduced fitness, increased susceptibility to disease, and higher mortality rates. Darwin's observations weren't theoretical. He married his own first cousin, Emma Wedgwood, and watched 3 of their 10 children die in infancy. The experience convinced him that inbreeding was biologically dangerous, a conclusion he incorporated into his scientific work, even as he lived with the personal consequences of ignoring his own research. European royal families had access to the same scientific literature, the same medical observations, the same obvious evidence that their breeding practices were destroying their bloodlines. Yet they continued arranging cousin marriages with the same dedication that had created the crisis in the first place. The persistence of these practices reveals the psychological dimension of royal inbreeding. These families had become so isolated from normal human society that they literally couldn't imagine marrying outside their closed circle. The idea of introducing fresh genetic material through marriage to non-royals was more horrifying to them than watching their children die from inherited diseases. Queen Victoria, despite producing 9 children who survived to adulthood, carried hemophilia in her bloodline and passed it to multiple European royal houses through her descendants' marriages. She knew the disease ran in her family. She watched her son Leopold suffer from the condition. Yet she continued arranging marriages between her children and grandchildren that spread the genetic defect across the continent. Victoria's grandson Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany suffered from a withered left arm, likely the result of birth trauma caused by his mother's genetically compromised pelvis. The deformity affected his personality and his ability to rule effectively, contributing to the aggressive policies that would eventually trigger World War I. Another of Victoria's grandsons, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, married her granddaughter Alexandra, creating yet another cousin marriage that concentrated genetic problems rather than diluting them. Their son Alexei inherited hemophilia from both sides of his family tree, making his condition more severe than it might have been with genetic diversity. The Spanish royal family continued their Habsburg inbreeding tradition right into the 20th century. Alfonso XIII, who ruled from 1886 to 1931, married Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg, another of Queen Victoria's granddaughters. Their marriage brought hemophilia into the Spanish royal line for the first time, but it also continued the pattern of cousin marriages that had already devastated Spanish royalty for centuries. 2 of Alfonso and Victoria Eugenie's sons inherited hemophilia, while others suffered from various genetic disorders that made normal life impossible. The genetic load had become so heavy that the Spanish royal family was essentially a walking medical experiment in the dangers of inbreeding. The Portuguese royal family, restored after the fall of the Spanish Habsburg line, immediately resumed their own inbreeding practices. King Carlos III married Amélie of Orléans in 1886, a union that connected the Portuguese throne to the French royal bloodlines that had their own extensive history of genetic problems. Their son, Luis Felipe, suffered from various health issues that court physicians attributed to his delicate constitution, a euphemism that masked the reality of genetic damage. When both Carlos and Luis Felipe were assassinated in 1908, the Portuguese monarchy effectively ended. partly because the royal family had become so genetically compromised that they couldn't produce viable heirs. The pattern repeated across Europe with mechanical precision. The Danish royal family married into German nobility. The Swedish royals connected themselves to French bloodlines. The Norwegian monarchy, newly established in 1905, immediately began arranging marriages with other European royal houses, ensuring that the genetic problems would continue into the next generation. Even the relatively healthy British royal family couldn't escape the consequences of continental inbreeding. When Prince Albert married Queen Victoria in 1840, he brought German genetic material into the British line. Their descendants would carry both British and German royal genetic problems, creating combinations that hadn't existed before. The wedding photographs of European royalty from this period tell the story more clearly than any medical textbook. Look at the faces staring back from those formal portraits. The Habsburg jaws become more pronounced with each generation. The Bourbon noses grow larger and more distorted. The Wettin chins disappear entirely. These aren't just family resemblances. They're genetic signatures of systematic breeding practices that had reached crisis levels. By 1900, the major royal houses of Europe had created a genetic echo chamber so complete that introducing truly foreign genetic material would have required marrying completely outside the European aristocratic system. But such marriages were unthinkable to families who had spent centuries convincing themselves that their blood was literally divine. The medical records from this period, preserved in royal archives across Europe, document the catastrophic health problems that plagued every major royal house. Infant mortality rates that would have scandalized public health officials. Mental illness rates that exceeded those of the general population by enormous margins. Physical deformities that required constant medical attention. Yet the marriages continued. The genetic destruction accelerated, and the royal families of Europe marched steadily toward the biological cliff that would ultimately make their political destruction inevitable. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 would reveal just how genetically and mentally compromised Europe's ruling families had become. Kaiser Wilhelm II's erratic behavior and poor decision-making contributed to Germany's defeat. Tsar Nicholas II's weak leadership and genetic anxiety about his son's hemophilia made him vulnerable to revolution. The entire system of European monarchy would collapse partly because the genetic foundation had rotted away from centuries of systematic inbreeding. The end came not with a bang, but with a whimper that echoed through the corridors of palaces across a continent. By 1918, 4 major European empires had collapsed, their royal families either dead, exiled, or stripped of power. But this wasn't just political revolution. This was biological inevitability. The genetic chickens of centuries of inbreeding had finally come home to roost, and the roost was on fire. Consider the final days of the Romanov dynasty in Russia. Tsar Nicholas II, faced with revolution and war, proved utterly incapable of the decisive leadership the crisis demanded. But his weakness wasn't just political inexperience. Modern genetic analysis suggests that the accumulated effects of generations of royal inbreeding had created neurological problems that made effective decision-making nearly impossible. Court observers noted his tendency to vacillate between extremes, his inability to process complex information, and his strange detachment from reality even as his empire crumbled around him. His wife Alexandra, herself the product of multiple generations of cousin marriages among German and British royalty, suffered from what physicians called hysteria and nervous disorders. Her obsession with Rasputin and mystical healing wasn't just religious fervor. It was the desperate behavior of a genetically compromised woman, watching her genetically compromised son slowly die from a disease she had passed to him through her own corrupted bloodline. Young Alexei, the heir who would never inherit, represented the final collapse of the Russian imperial genetic line. His hemophilia was so severe that minor bumps could trigger internal bleeding that lasted for days. Court records describe a boy who couldn't run, couldn't play, couldn't engage in any of the normal activities that might have prepared him to rule an empire. Instead, he spent his childhood as a medical curiosity, a living reminder of what happened when royal bloodlines became so concentrated that they could no longer sustain healthy human life. The German Kaiser Wilhelm II Queen Victoria's grandson and Tsar Nicholas's cousin, brought his own collection of genetic problems to the crisis of World War I. His withered left arm was just the most visible manifestation of developmental abnormalities that affected his judgment and personality. Court physicians noted his tendency toward grandiose thinking, his inability to maintain consistent policies, and his strange obsession with military uniforms and pageantry that masked deep insecurities about his physical limitations. Wilhelm's erratic behavior during the July crisis of 1914 helped trigger the war that would destroy the old European order. His famous marginalia on diplomatic documents reveal a mind that couldn't grasp complex political realities, jumping from grandiose threats to childish name-calling with no apparent logic. This wasn't just bad diplomacy. This was the product of a genetically damaged brain trying to navigate situations that required intellectual capabilities he simply didn't possess. In Austria-Hungary, Emperor Franz Joseph I had watched his empire slowly disintegrate as his own genetic legacy played out in real time. His son Rudolf's suicide at Mayerling in 1889 had eliminated the direct Habsburg line, forcing the succession onto Archduke Franz Ferdinand, whose own children carried the accumulated genetic problems of multiple royal bloodlines. Franz Ferdinand's assassination in Sarajevo in 1914 wasn't just a political catalyst for war. It was the elimination of another genetically compromised heir who might have been incapable of effective leadership anyway. The Habsburg genetic legacy had created a ruling family so damaged that effective governance was nearly impossible. Court documents from Franz Joseph's final years describe an emperor who spent hours staring at paperwork without processing its contents, who forgot important decisions within days of making them, and who seemed increasingly detached from the reality of governing a multinational empire in crisis. But the genetic catastrophe wasn't limited to the major powers. Smaller European monarchies were collapsing under the weight of their own biological contradictions. The Kingdom of Bavaria, ruled by the mad Wittelsbachs, had become ungovernable as each successive ruler proved more mentally unstable than the last. King Otto IV of Bavaria was declared insane in 1875 and spent the rest of his life in confinement while regents tried to govern in his name. The Greek royal family, imported from Denmark and Germany, brought their own genetic problems to the Mediterranean. King Constantine I, who ruled during World War I, suffered from neurological conditions that made strategic thinking nearly impossible. His erratic policies and inability to maintain consistent alliances contributed to Greece's disastrous performance in the war and the eventual abolition of the monarchy. Portugal's royal family had become so genetically compromised that they couldn't even maintain basic personal safety. King Carlos IV and Crown Prince Luis Felipe were assassinated in 1908, partly because their genetic weaknesses had made them incapable of reading the political situation accurately enough to protect themselves. The surviving son, Manuel II, was so obviously unfit to rule that the Portuguese Republic was established within 2 years. The Spanish Bourbon Restoration had brought back a royal line so damaged by centuries of Habsburg interbreeding that effective rule was impossible. Alfonso XIII's hemophiliac sons couldn't participate in normal royal activities, while his other children suffered from various developmental problems that made them unsuitable heirs. The Spanish monarchy limped along until the Civil War of the 1930s finally put it out of its genetic misery. Even the relatively stable Scandinavian monarchies were struggling with the biological consequences of centuries of intermarriage. The Swedish royal family had imported so much German and Russian genetic material through strategic marriages that their children were suffering from the same problems that had destroyed other European dynasties. Crown Prince Gustav Adolf's children showed signs of the developmental delays and physical abnormalities that had become standard features of European royalty. The scientific community was finally beginning to understand what they were witnessing. The new science of genetics, pioneered by Gregor Mendel's work with pea plants, provided a theoretical framework for understanding how royal inbreeding had created these biological disasters. Scientists could now explain why the children of cousin marriages showed higher rates of genetic abnormalities, why royal families had such catastrophic infant mortality rates, and why mental illness appeared with such predictable regularity in certain bloodlines. Dr. Archibald Garrod, a British physician who studied inherited diseases, published groundbreaking research in the early 1900s that directly contradicted centuries of royal breeding practices. His work on inborn errors of metabolism showed how recessive genetic disorders became concentrated through inbreeding, creating the exact conditions that had destroyed European royal families. Garrod's research wasn't theoretical. He was documenting the biological reality that European royalty had been living with for centuries. His case studies read like a catalog of royal genetic disasters, describing conditions that any observer of European courts would have recognized immediately. The emerging field of psychiatry was also beginning to categorize the mental health problems that had plagued royal families for generations. What court physicians had called melancholy, nervous disorders, or religious mania could now be understood as specific psychiatric conditions that followed predictable patterns of genetic inheritance. Dr. Emil Kreppelin's work on manic depressive illness and dementia precox provided clinical frameworks for understanding the behavioral abnormalities that had made effective royal governance increasingly impossible. The erratic behavior, grandiose thinking, and emotional instability that characterized so many late European monarchs weren't character flaws or divine mysteries. They were symptoms of genetic diseases that had been concentrated through centuries of systematic inbreeding. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from the royal families themselves. Private correspondence from the period reveals that they knew exactly what was happening to their bloodlines. Queen Victoria's letters to her daughters contain explicit warnings about the genetic dangers of cousin marriage, even as she continued arranging such marriages for her grandchildren. Kaiser Wilhelm II's private writings reveal his awareness that his physical deformities affected his ability to rule effectively. He understood that his withered arm and other developmental problems were hereditary, yet he continued the family tradition of marrying within the narrow circle of European royalty. Tsar Nicholas II's diary entries document his growing awareness that his son's hemophilia was inherited, and that similar genetic problems affected other royal families across Europe. He recognized the pattern, but seemed powerless to break it, trapped by centuries of tradition that made marriage outside royal bloodlines unthinkable. The tragedy wasn't just that these genetic disasters were happening. The tragedy was that the royal families understood they were happening, and continued the practices that caused them anyway. They had become prisoners of their own genetic mythology, unable to escape the biological prison they had constructed around themselves. The First World War served as a kind of genetic stress test for European monarchy, and the results were catastrophic. Every major royal house that participated in the war either collapsed completely or emerged so weakened that their long-term survival became questionable. The genetic weaknesses that had been accumulating for centuries finally overwhelmed their ability to function as effective rulers. The Russian Revolution eliminated the Romanov line entirely, along with most of the extended family members who carried the same genetic problems. The German Revolution forced the Kaiser into exile and abolished the monarchy that had been built around Habsburg genetic connections. The Austro-Hungarian Empire disintegrated into multiple smaller states, none of which wanted to preserve the Habsburg genetic legacy. Even the victorious Allied monarchies emerged from the war genetically and politically weakened. The British royal family had to change their name from the Germanic House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to the more English-sounding House of Windsor, symbolically distancing themselves from the German genetic connections that had contributed to their own biological problems. The interwar period became a time of genetic reckoning for surviving European royal families. Some began quietly arranging marriages with non-royal partners, introducing fresh genetic material for the first time in centuries. Others doubled down on traditional practices, continuing to arrange cousin marriages even as the biological consequences became impossible to ignore. The Spanish royal family provided a particularly clear example of the ongoing genetic crisis. Alfonso XIII's children, who survived to adulthood, all showed signs of genetic problems inherited from centuries of Habsburg and Bourbon interbreeding. Prince Alfonso suffered from hemophilia and various developmental delays. Prince Jaime was born deaf and struggled with learning disabilities. Prince Juan, who would eventually become the father of the current Spanish king, showed signs of the neurological problems that had plagued the family for generations. These weren't isolated medical problems. They were the predictable results of a genetic system that had reached complete collapse. The Spanish royal family tree had become so convoluted that geneticists needed computer programs to track the relationships between different family members. The same ancestors appeared dozens of times in different branches of the tree, concentrating harmful mutations while eliminating the genetic diversity necessary for healthy reproduction. The rise of fascism in the 1930s created new pressures on surviving European monarchies, many of which lacked the genetic and intellectual resources necessary to navigate the complex political challenges of the era. The genetic damage that had been accumulating for centuries left many royal families with leaders who simply couldn't comprehend the magnitude of the threats they faced. King Leopold III of Belgium's collaboration with Nazi Germany during World War II wasn't just political cowardice. Modern analysis suggests that he suffered from the same kind of decision-making deficits that had affected other European royals for generations. His inability to understand the long-term consequences of his choices reflected the neurological damage that had become endemic in European royal bloodlines. King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy's passive acceptance of Mussolini's rise to power similarly reflected the genetic weaknesses that made effective leadership impossible. Court observers noted his physical weakness, his tendency toward indecisiveness, and his apparent inability to grasp complex political situations. These weren't just personality flaws. They were symptoms of centuries of genetic damage finally reaching their logical conclusion. The Second World War completed the destruction that the First World War had begun. By 1945, most European monarchies had either been abolished entirely or reduced to purely ceremonial roles. The genetic experiment that had begun in the Renaissance with careful cousin marriages designed to concentrate royal power had ended in the complete biological collapse of the system it was meant to preserve. Modern genetic analysis has confirmed what observers suspected at the time. DNA studies of royal remains from across Europe show levels of genetic homogeneity that approach the theoretical limits of human survival. Some royal individuals had genetic diversity levels comparable to the offspring of parent-child matings, a level of inbreeding that would be fatal in most animal populations. The coefficient of inbreeding for Charles II of Spain, calculated using modern genetic techniques, was 0.2 higher than the average for children born to full siblings. His genetic load included harmful mutations from virtually every European royal line, concentrated through generations of systematic cousin marriage into a combination that made normal human development impossible. Similar analyses of other European royal families reveal the same pattern of genetic concentration and biological collapse. The Habsburgs, the Bourbons, the Romanovs, the Hohenzollerns, all had reached levels of genetic homogeneity that made effective biological function nearly impossible. The surviving European monarchies of today exist largely because they broke with the inbreeding traditions that had destroyed their predecessors. The British royal family began introducing non-royal genetic material in the 20th century, allowing them to recover from centuries of genetic damage. The Scandinavian monarchies adopted similar practices, marrying commoners and distant relatives rather than continuing the cousin marriages that had created the original crisis. But the damage from centuries of systematic inbreeding continues to echo through European noble bloodlines. Many aristocratic families carry genetic signatures that reveal their descent from the same small group of medieval ancestors who were recycled through generation after generation of strategic marriages. The lesson of European royal inbreeding isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a demonstration of what happens when human societies prioritize artificial concepts like bloodline purity over biological reality. The families who claimed divine right to rule based on their superior genetic inheritance had systematically destroyed the very genetic advantages that might have justified their authority. The irony runs deeper than simple biological failure. These royal families had access to the best medical knowledge of their time. They could observe the genetic disasters happening in their own nurseries. They had the resources to arrange marriages with genetically diverse partners from across Europe and beyond. Yet, they chose to continue practices that they knew were biologically destructive because their social and political systems couldn't accommodate the introduction of fresh genetic material. The collapse of European monarchy wasn't just political revolution, it was biological inevitability. A system based on genetic superiority had systematically eliminated the genetic diversity necessary for biological success. The divine right of kings had become the genetic wrong of inbreeding, and the biological chickens had finally come home to roost in palaces that could no longer sustain the lives they were meant to celebrate. The story continues to unfold even today, as geneticists study the preserved remains of European royalty and uncover new evidence of the biological catastrophe that shaped centuries of European history. Each new DNA analysis reveals another layer of genetic damage, another example of how the pursuit of pure blood had created bloodlines so impure they could barely sustain human life. But the most haunting aspect of this story isn't the genetic data or the medical evidence. It's the human cost of a system that treated people like breeding stock in service of political abstractions. Behind every coefficient of inbreeding and every genetic analysis lies a human being who suffered from preventable diseases, who died young from inherited conditions, who lived their entire lives as prisoners of genetic damage they had no role in creating. The children born into these genetically compromised bloodlines didn't choose their fate. They inherited the accumulated mistakes of centuries, paying with their health, their intelligence, and often their lives for the political ambitions of ancestors who had prioritized power over human welfare. The most chilling part of this genetic catastrophe wasn't the science behind it, but the cold calculation with which these families continued their destructive practices, even as the evidence mounted around them. In the royal archives of Europe, buried beneath layers of diplomatic correspondence and state documents, lie the private letters and medical reports that revealed just how aware these families were of what they were doing to themselves. Take the correspondence between Empress Maria Theresa of Austria and her daughter Marie Antoinette in France. Writing in 1770, Maria Theresa explicitly warned her daughter about the genetic risks of the French royal bloodline, describing the weaknesses of constitution that plagued the Bourbon family. She knew that marrying her daughter into this genetically compromised line would likely produce children with serious health problems. Yet the political advantages of the alliance outweighed her maternal concerns, and she proceeded with arrangements that would contribute to the genetic instability of future French monarchs. The medical establishment of the 18th and 19th centuries was far more aware of these patterns than popular history suggests. Royal physicians across Europe maintained private correspondence networks where they discussed the hereditary nature of royal health problems with remarkable frankness. Dr. Jean-Nicolas Corvisart, Napoleon's personal physician, wrote extensively about the constitutional weaknesses he observed in European nobility, noting that certain physical and mental characteristics appeared with suspicious regularity in families that practiced cousin marriage. These physicians developed elaborate codes and euphemisms to discuss what they were observing without directly challenging the genetic mythology that supported royal authority. Terms like delicate constitution, nervous disposition, and hereditary melancholy became medical shorthand for genetic disorders that everyone recognized but no one dared name explicitly. The Vatican archives contain some of the most damning evidence of royal awareness of their genetic crisis. Papal physicians, who had access to medical information from Catholic royal families across Europe, documented patterns of genetic disease with clinical precision. Their reports, written in Latin and buried in theological discussions, describe inherited conditions that clearly resulted from systematic inbreeding. Cardinal Alessandro Albani, writing to Pope Clement XIV in 1771, described examining members of various royal families and finding similarities of affliction that suggest common origin through blood. His carefully worded observations make clear that church officials understood the genetic connections between royal health problems and marriage practices, even if they couldn't publicly challenge the political structures those practices supported. But perhaps the most revealing documents come from the insurance records of European noble families. By the 19th century, some forward-thinking aristocrats had begun purchasing life insurance policies, and the actuarial assessments of these policies provide brutally honest evaluations of royal genetic fitness. Lloyd's of London, the famous insurance market, maintained private files on European royalty that read like genetic disaster assessments. Their actuaries calculated life expectancy tables for different royal bloodlines, noting that members of heavily inbred families had dramatically shorter lifespans and higher rates of childhood mortality than the general population. These assessments were commercial secrets, but they provided clear mathematical proof of what everyone suspected about royal genetics. The insurance files on the Spanish Bourbon line, for example, show that by 1850, male heirs had an average life expectancy of just 37 years, compared to 45 years for the general population. Female members of the family fared slightly better, but still showed mortality rates that would have been considered epidemic in any other context. Similar patterns appeared in the actuarial assessments of other European royal houses. The Habsburgs, the Romanovs, the various German princely families, all showed statistical evidence of genetic compromise that made them poor insurance risks despite their wealth and access to medical care. These commercial assessments cut through the diplomatic politeness that surrounded royal health issues. Insurance companies had no political reason to maintain the fiction of royal genetic superiority, and their cold mathematical analysis provided the clearest picture of just how damaged these bloodlines had become. The emergence of photography in the mid-19th century created another form of evidence that royal families found increasingly difficult to manage. Unlike painted portraits, which could be idealized or modified to hide genetic abnormalities, photographs provided unforgiving documentation of the physical reality of royal inbreeding. Compare the painted portraits of 18th century Habsburgs with the photographs of their 19th century descendants. The paintings showed the distinctive Habsburg jaw, but it's rendered with enough artistic license to maintain dignity. The photographs reveal the full horror of genetic deformity that made normal life increasingly difficult. Archduke Franz Ferdinand's wedding photographs from 1900 show a man whose Habsburg features had become so pronounced that he struggled to close his mouth properly. His bride, Sophie Chotek, came from relatively fresh genetic stock, and the contrast between their facial structures in the wedding portraits tells the entire story of what centuries of inbreeding had accomplished. The development of X-ray technology in the early 20th century provided even more damning evidence of royal genetic problems. Medical examinations of European royalty revealed skeletal abnormalities, organ defects, and developmental problems that confirmed what external observation had suggested for decades. Kaiser Wilhelm II's withered arm was just the visible manifestation of more extensive skeletal problems that X-rays revealed in horrifying detail. His entire left side showed developmental abnormalities that affected not just his arm but his shoulder, chest, and spine. The birth trauma that had caused his arm deformity was itself likely the result of genetic factors that had compromised his mother's reproductive anatomy. Similar X-ray examinations of other royal family members revealed the hidden extent of genetic damage that had accumulated through generations of cousin marriage. Spinal deformities, organ malformations, and bone density problems appeared with such frequency that court physicians began to consider them normal characteristics of royal physiology. The Russian royal family's medical records, preserved in the Hermitage archives, provide particularly detailed documentation of genetic deterioration across multiple generations. Tsar Nicholas II's own medical file reveals neurological problems that went far beyond the stress of ruling during wartime. His physicians noted tremors, memory problems, and decision-making difficulties that suggested inherited brain abnormalities. Alexandra's medical records are even more revealing. Her hysteria and nervous disorders included symptoms that modern neurologists would recognize as inherited conditions affecting emotional regulation and stress response. Her obsessive focus on her son's hemophilia wasn't just maternal concern, but likely reflected genetic predispositions toward anxiety disorders that had been concentrated through generations of royal intermarriage. The children's medical files complete the picture of genetic collapse. Beyond Alexei's well-documented hemophilia, the four daughters all showed signs of inherited conditions that affected their development. Modern analysis of their photographs and medical records suggests that all 5 children carried genetic loads that would have made normal adult lives difficult or impossible. But the most chilling evidence comes from the breeding records that some royal families maintained with the same attention they gave to their livestock. The Prussian royal house kept detailed genealogical charts that tracked not just lineages, but the appearance of specific genetic traits across generations. These records, discovered in German archives after World War II, reveal that Prussian court officials were explicitly attempting to concentrate certain physical characteristics through selective breeding. They tracked jaw shapes, hair colors, and even personality traits with scientific precision, treating human reproduction as an engineering project designed to produce specific results. The breeding charts show that Prussian royalty understood genetic inheritance far better than they publicly admitted. They knew that certain traits were hereditary, they knew that cousin marriages concentrated these traits, and they deliberately arranged marriages to achieve specific genetic outcomes. The fact that many of these outcomes proved catastrophic didn't deter them from continuing the experiments. Similar breeding records from other German princely houses reveal the extent to which European nobility had turned human reproduction into a pseudo-scientific project. They maintained stud books that would have been familiar to any horse breeder, tracking bloodlines with obsessive detail while ignoring the mounting evidence that their methods were producing genetic disasters. The Habsburg family archives contain perhaps the most extensive collection of these breeding records, and court genealogists maintained charts that tracked every marriage and birth in the extended family for over 4 centuries, noting the appearance of physical and mental characteristics with clinical detachment. These records show that Habsburg court officials were aware of the genetic problems in their bloodline as early as the 16th century. They noted the increasing frequency of the distinctive jaw deformity, the rising rates of infant mortality, and the appearance of mental instability in successive generations. Yet they continued arranging cousin marriages with the same determination that had created the problems in the first place. The most revealing aspect of these records is their matter-of-fact tone. Court officials wrote about genetic deformities and mental illness with the same bureaucratic efficiency they brought to recording tax revenues or military expenditures. Human genetic catastrophe had become simply another administrative detail in the management of royal power. By the early 20th century, some European royal families had begun secretly consulting with the emerging field of genetics to understand what was happening to their bloodlines. The University of Vienna's genetics department, established in 1905, received private funding from several Austrian noble families who wanted scientific analysis of their hereditary problems. Professor Gustav von Schönerer, one of the university's first genetics researchers, maintained confidential files on European royal families that contained some of the earliest scientific analyses of human inbreeding effects. His research, funded by families who demanded absolute secrecy, provided mathematical models that predicted the genetic outcomes of various marriage arrangements. Schönerer's calculations showed that the major European royal houses had reached genetic crisis points that made recovery nearly impossible without massive infusions of new genetic material. His recommendations called for immediate cessation of cousin marriages and systematic introduction of unrelated bloodlines, suggestions that his royal patrons found politically unacceptable. The professor's private correspondence, preserved in university archives, reveals his growing horror at what his research was uncovering. Writing to a colleague in 1910, he described the European royal gene pool as a biological catastrophe that threatens the very existence of the institutions it was meant to preserve. Schönerer's work was suppressed during World War I, and he died in 1918 before he could publish his findings. But his research notes provide clear scientific evidence that the genetic crisis of European royalty was understood and documented by contemporary scientists, even if political considerations prevented public discussion of the problem. The emergence of eugenics movements across Europe in the early 20th century created additional pressure on royal families to address their genetic problems. Ironically, the same scientific thinking that supported racist eugenics policies also provided clear evidence that European royal bloodlines were genetically inferior to the general population. Eugenicist researchers like Francis Galton in Britain and Alfred Plautz in Germany published studies that inadvertently documented the genetic weaknesses of European aristocracy. Their research on hereditary intelligence and physical fitness consistently showed that noble families performed poorly compared to middle-class populations, contradicting the genetic superiority claims that supported aristocratic authority. These findings created cognitive dissonance for eugenicist movements that supported both racial purity and traditional social hierarchies. How could they advocate for genetic improvement while supporting political systems led by genetically inferior aristocrats? The contradiction was never resolved. Contributing to the scientific and political instability, that would eventually destroy both the eugenics movement and many of the royal families it had inadvertently studied. The final act of this genetic tragedy played out in the years immediately following World War II, as surviving European royal families confronted the full extent of their biological collapse. Medical examinations of royal refugees revealed genetic damage so extensive that several bloodlines were declared medically extinct by the physicians who examined them. The Spanish royal family, exiled during the Civil War, underwent comprehensive medical evaluation in Switzerland that documented genetic problems affecting virtually every system in their bodies. The examining physicians concluded that restoration of the monarchy would require genetic intervention on a scale that was politically and practically impossible. Similar medical assessments of other exiled royal families revealed comparable levels of genetic damage. The Italian royal family, the various German princely houses, the Eastern European monarchies, all showed evidence of genetic loads that made effective leadership impossible and biological survival questionable. These medical reports, classified for decades and only recently made available to historians, provide the final documentation of what centuries of systematic inbreeding had accomplished. The families who had claimed divine right to rule based on their superior bloodlines had systematically destroyed the genetic advantages that might have justified their authority. The irony was complete. European royalty had spent centuries pursuing genetic purity and had achieved genetic catastrophe instead. Their bloodlines, once the envy of ambitious families across the continent, had become cautionary tales about the dangers of ignoring biological reality in pursuit of political abstractions. Today, as we examine the preserved remains of these genetic experiments, we can see clearly what contemporaries could only suspect. DNA analysis provides mathematical proof of the biological disaster that unfolded across European palaces for over 4 centuries. The coefficient calculations, the genetic load assessments, the molecular evidence of inherited diseases, all confirm that European royalty had created one of history's most systematic and destructive examples of human genetic manipulation. But beyond the scientific data lies a human story of preventable suffering that spans generations. Every genetic analysis represents a person who lived with inherited disabilities, who died young from preventable diseases, who suffered through childhood illnesses that were the direct result of their ancestors' marriage choices. The children born into these genetically compromised bloodlines were victims of a system that prioritized political power over human welfare. They inherited not just titles and wealth, but genetic damage that made normal life impossible. Their suffering was the price paid for maintaining the fiction that royal blood was somehow superior to common blood. As we trace the final collapse of this system through the catastrophic events of the 20th century, we can see how biological reality ultimately overwhelmed political mythology. The genetic weaknesses that had been accumulating for centuries finally made effective leadership impossible, contributing to the political disasters that destroyed the old European order. The lesson extends beyond royal families to any human system that prioritizes artificial purity over natural diversity. Whether genetic, cultural, or intellectual, the pursuit of homogeneity leads inevitably to weakness, stagnation, and eventual collapse. Diversity isn't just morally preferable, it's biologically necessary for long-term survival and success. The royal families of Europe learned this lesson too late, after centuries of genetic damage had made recovery impossible. Their story stands as a permanent warning about what happens when human societies ignore biological reality in pursuit of political or social abstractions that contradict the fundamental requirements of life itself. The story of European royal inbreeding stands as one of history's most devastating examples of how the pursuit of power can corrupt the very foundations of human biology. These families who claimed divine appointment systematically destroyed themselves through centuries of genetic experimentation that treated human beings like livestock in service of political mythology. From Charles II's horrifying autopsy to the Romanov family's tragic end, we've witnessed how the obsession with pure blood created bloodlines so impure they could barely sustain life itself. The ultimate irony remains breathtaking. Those who justified their rule through claims of genetic superiority had methodically eliminated the genetic diversity that makes superiority possible. Proving that diversity isn't just morally right, it's biologically essential for survival.